Rochester Today with Andy Brownell and Tom Ostrom on News Talk 1340 KROC AM and 96.9 FM.
Good morning. Andy Brownell with Tom Ostrom on this Thursday edition of Rochester Today. Good morning, Tom.
Morning, Andy.
Always great to see you. What do you have for us in the mailbag today?
Okay, the Babylon Bee. And this is happening, too. Obama is bawling out black male voters for saying they're not going to vote for Kamala. They're voting for Trump, and he's really assaulted them in public and insulted them. And one black replied and said, "Do you want us back on the plantation? We can't think for ourselves." So Babylon Bee is picking up on that, and it shows a picture of Obama in lecturing to black males, and it says, "Now is not the time for independent thinking," Obama tells black Trump voters, and that's what he is telling them. Reminded black males that the election season is not the time to be independent. You need to make a wise, rational choice and stop being uppity.
This is the Babylon Bee.
That's Babylon Bee picking up on the introduction I gave. Teasing Obama for his blatant oppressive remarks to black males. And for 400 years, the black man has been put down and told not to think for himself, and I'm just asking for 8 more years of it, says Obama.
Gosh, that's terrible.
Jesus. It's just so neat how the Babylon Bee picks up on things. And what they say is satire often is so true that they have to make it funny.
Because what Obama more or less said, paraphrasing, was that black men who don't vote for Kamala Harris are doing so because they're sexist.
Yeah.
That's pretty heavy-handed, yes.
Sure is. And then satirical cartoonist Margolis. This is so funny. Walz had trouble putting his shells into his weapon when he was pheasant hunting. So Margolis is on top of it. It shows Walz in his hunting outfit. And I don't know if people remember the old Bugs Bunny cartoon, Elmer Fudd, who was always after the rabbit. And he always had a plaid shirt and a goofy hat on. So they got Walz looking like that with the shotgun in his hand. And at the end of the barrel is a pheasant perched on his barrel looking at him.
Elmer Fudd.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, that just reminds me. We spoke about the pheasant hunting opener on Tuesday, and I said I thought that it was Walz who had been the start of that. And it was Mark Dayton who was the start of the pheasant opener.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's fun. But this cartoon picture shows Walz looking befuddled in that outfit and a pheasant sitting right on the barrel of his gun looking at him. Go ahead.
With the cap on and everything, there is a resemblance.
Yeah, it's funny. From Wayne. Tim Walz visited China 30 times. Trips funded by China. He failed in the recent VP debate to criticize the Chinese army for the 1989 massacre of 5,000 people at Tiananmen Square. Tim supported the 100 Confucius Institutes in colleges and universities across the U.S. I remember those, and they were really pro-Chinese seminars for college students. Wayne said most of those have since closed on campuses. And then Wayne says, why did he praise communist China for more than 20 years? What is his thoughts on China? And then,
just another interesting dichotomy concerning that is some of the statements attributed to Governor Walz suggest that in the past he has said things that expressed admiration for Chinese the Chinese government and the way it deals with its citizens, which I would imagine in retrospect he probably wishes he had not said. And the reason I find it interesting is that the Democrats, and Kamala Harris particularly, are trying to shine spotlights on things that Donald Trump has said, in which he has expressed seemingly admiration for some of the quote-unquote strongmen type political leaders in the world today and the way that they handle certain situations in their countries. I mean, there is a bit of irony in that.
Sure, you bet there is. Martha Raddatz was on with J.D. Vance, and she said how Trump has exaggerated the Aurora apartment buildings being taken over by gangs, Venezuelan gangs. And I saw that interview, and Raddatz said to J.D. Vance, you and Trump have exaggerated. The mayor there says that it's just a handful of apartments. And this is true. J.D. Vance looked at her and said, Martha, do you know what you're saying? Can you hear yourself? Just a handful have been taken over, and you say Trump is lying? What about the people who say there's nothing there, which you are saying?
I heard that interview as well.
He's so good. So Criticus responding. The article here gives the real story of the gang takeovers in apartment buildings in Aurora, Colorado. I love that J.D. Vance took that miserable Martha Raddatz to task on her assertion there's only a handful of apartments that have been taken over. And the Babylon Bee had a picture of the 9/11 tragedy, and Martha Raddatz saying just a handful of buildings were destroyed.
I kind of knew that was coming.
Yeah. And Criticus says she was too stupid to realize her comment admitted that it was happening, and it could be 4 or 5 more building. It's an extortion scheme, not much different than the mafia shakedowns of the stores when they would go and say, you got a nice business here. It'd be a shame if anything happened to it. It's amazing, the media, arrogance and ignorance. That's the mailbag.
And the other part about that story about Aurora is that the reassurances by the local police that this has been handled. Well, okay, yeah. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Sure.
It means the police responded to an incident or incidences, and there was some truth to this. I don't, when it gets to this point in the campaign season, I think everything is exaggerated to a point to, make political hay. But to have the pushback be that strong from her, the correspondent or host of the show, yeah, I could see making the point and say, the Harris campaign says this, what's your response? And let them respond to it. But to have her be the arbiter of the truth in this situation, or attempt to be, was misplaced. She shouldn't have done it. That's for sure.
Sure.
Okay. We will take a break. That's it for the mailbag bag in just a few moments on Rochester Today with Tom Ostrom and Andy Brownell, News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96 Knobley.
Rochester Today with Andy Brownell and Tom Ostrom on News Talk 1340 KROC AM and 96.9 FM.
Welcome back to the show. It's Rochester Today. Andy Brownell with Tom Ostrom on a Thursday morning. And what do you want to begin with Minnesota topics, Tom?
From the KROC News website, your article, Andy. It appears, says your article and you, it appears the state of Minnesota building up another revenue fund. The update by the Office of Management and Budget, tax collections and revenues for the first quarter exceeded predictions, 3.2% above the level that was predicted. And the report shows income tax payments are up, and sales revenues are up in the billions, and looks like a good revenue thing. And the economic consultant, you say, used by the state, is saying domestic product growth has improved since it was last updated. Real GDP 2.7 this year, and up. It's predicted for next year too, and so it looks fortunate in terms of funding.
Well, some would argue that it's evidence that we are overtaxed. It's interesting to note too that the differences between the forecast and the actual collections remain above what was predicted, but the amount that they're above what they were predicted is smaller than it had been 6 months ago, let's say. And I'm not sure if that means, that we're seeing an economic softening, I guess, because I wouldn't call it by any stretch of the imagination a recession. As you point out, the GDP is doing better than expected. But things aren't ripping and roaring like they were 6 to 8 months ago when we were seeing that the revenues were coming in 8, 9, 10% above the projections. But the other interesting thing to note that some of the largest sources of revenue that are exceeding projections on a consistent basis are these fees and miscellaneous incomes, not taxes per se, but permitting fees, state park fees, all sorts of new charges that Minnesotans pay to gain access to either the waterways or state parks, or to participate in the economy by opening new businesses or building new buildings. Those fees, which the last budget approved by the state included significant increases in those fees, have been consistently generating more revenue than expected. Just an observation.
Yes. The indigenous people of Minnesota, they are the discoverers of America and discoverers of Minnesota, our Native American population in history. From Minnesota News, the Minnesota Indigenous Nonprofit Organization received $1.5 million. They didn't know they were going to get it. They didn't even know who the donor was, or they didn't know that the donor was aware of them, Mackenzie Scott.
Yep.
And
Bezos's ex-wife.
Yeah, Bezos' ex-wife, and they're very pleased with that. And Scott's gift is the latest in a long line of donations she's made in Minnesota. Wave of doing it. She's Seattle-based, and she's given other grants too over the summer. But a nice gift to the indigenous Minnesotans.
My son-in-law works for a outfit up in northern Minnesota that offers low-interest loans to business startups. It's an economic development agency, let's put it that way. And they, out of the blue, got a $9 million donation from the same person. Also did not apply for it. It came as a complete surprise, and it essentially had no strings attached other than to use it for the mission of your organization to promote economic activity in that part of the world and do it in the way that you're doing it. And it also stipulated that don't expect us to show up for any, recognition activities to celebrate the donation. We just, here's the money, do your good thing. And I thought that was refreshing. Somebody using an enormous amount of wealth, because she, I imagine, got half of Bezos's billions and has been going around the country just handing it out by the millions all over the place without any fanfare.
Mm-hmm.
I may not agree with some of the groups that she's given money to, but you know what? That's her prerogative.
That's right. Representative Virginia Fox is a North Carolina congresswoman, She's all business. I've heard her speak, and she runs committee meetings assertively. And she's going after our Governor Walz, the vice presidential aspirant. She said Americans have been cheated out of $250 million by Walz at his failure in that food scandal, our future scam. And so she's investigating it. She subpoenaed Walz for information that feeding our future scam. She said $250 million was stolen from the American people, and it hasn't been administered well by Walz or responded to well. He hasn't accounted for it. He hasn't been held accountable. And we're going to find out what he knew, why he failed to act. And we're going after him not because he's a vice presidential nominee. We're going after the state of Minnesota, where he was governor, because of the tax situation and the bilking of taxpayers and fund. He's not a steward of money. And the defendants in that scandal diverted allegedly $250 million from a federal child nutrition program to feed needy children, and they spent the money on themselves. And several have been charged. Some are pleading guilty. Some have been convicted. But so Walz has got that in his rearview mirror to deal with coming up.
And whether or not that'll happen before the election, I doubt it. But at the same time, the statements that the Congresswoman made, they're accurate. The money was stolen from taxpayers. And I would say it's at least $250 million. That's the amount that has been documented by the Justice Department in its prosecution of the case. One of the people who was convicted was just sentenced this week to 12 years in prison. This person, part of a group that swindled the taxpayers out of $40 million of that $250 million. And yes, restitution will be ordered, but good luck recovering the money. It's gone, it's gone to the wind, most of it. You might have luck in freezing some accounts within the United States, but some of these people were savvy enough to move the money overseas into parts of the world where our Justice Department has very little authority over the banking situation. So their ability to retrieve these assets is minuscule in some cases. The money's gone. A lot of it is just going to be gone. You might be able to recover a fraction of it, but it's still, I'm still incredulous as to how this could have happened and how, despite all of the warning flags that were plain for anyone to see as these applications were coming in for these reimbursements to this program, and there were people who said, hey, this doesn't look right, and people up the chain, apparently, and I say apparently because action was not taken to halt it, ignored it, or moved it further up the chain because they didn't want to be responsible for the decision that would put them into a political hot seat. And then even when it did get to the courts, the Walz administration makes this claim that a court had ordered them to continue making the payments when it was completely false. The judge, in a rare circumstance, was given permission by the state Supreme Court, which, by the way, largely appointed by Democratic governors, including Governor Walz, gave this individual judge the almost unprecedented authority to rebut the governor of the state of Minnesota by saying, what you're saying isn't true. There is no court order. You guys went ahead and did it anyway. Mm-hmm. And all of this just is fuzzy background noise now in the political circles. It's amazing to me.
Right. Walz is getting a lot of criticism, and he's not helping the Harris ticket at all. A couple of days ago, Trump's vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, stopped in the Twin Cities, and he took aim at Walz's failed leadership there. He said the Precinct 3 building was set on fire, police officers attacked, and Vance said these officers were left for dead by their leaders. And now the guy responsible, Walz, wants to be vice president. And he goes after Walz, and he touched down in Minneapolis, St. Paul with his wife. She's a distinguished attorney. They came in on Trump Force 2, and they headed straight to a private fundraiser. and then he visited the site of the burned out 3rd Precinct, and he met with officers and staff who had been inside. They thought they were going to die. One officer lost most of his teeth, been hit by a brick in the face by rioters. And Vance was flanked by Minneapolis police officers, and he didn't mince words. He said Walz failed in this instance, and in the 2020 riots, Walz was ineffective and counterproductive. And Vance said what happened there is absurd. And then the anti-police attitude of some Democrats and defund the police. And he said there's a nationwide shortage of police officers, partly because of the lack of support from political leaders. So there he was in the Twin Cities blasting Walz. So Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey slammed Vance for visiting and said his visit to the 3rd Precinct and what he's talking about is, quote, a stunt, taking cheap shots at Walz. Well, I don't think the shots are untrue, whether they're cheap or not. And so Vance, too, said, I think there's a chance that we could take Minnesota in the election.
It's interesting you say that. In the polls, the latest KSTP poll, they seem to be the ones who do these statewide polls for political reasons or political purposes. The last one, which was a while ago, showed that Harris's lead had widened since it narrowed up. So there's a fluctuation there, but I had seen a map that was put together through some analytical outfit trying to illustrate the electoral college map of the United States and which states were firmly in the hold of this candidate and which states are firmly in the hold of the other candidate, and which ones are, battleground or swing states, and which ones are leaning toward one candidate or the other. And Minnesota was among those that was categorized as leaning toward Harris and not firmly in her camp. And I found that interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. I think we should take a break for news.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We'll be back in just a few minutes. Tom Ostrom's here. I'm Andy Brownell. This is Rochester Today on News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96.9
FM.
Good morning and welcome back. Rochester Today, Thursday morning. I'm Andy Brownell, of course, with Tom Ostrom. And Tom, I'll let you lead things off with national news.
We already covered that Kamala Harris got good treatment on CBS to the point of them allegedly doctoring her interview, taking statements from other times and putting it into that interview. House Speaker Mike Johnson was on CBS News since then, last Sunday. And he went after CBS News for trimming down and cutting out much of his Sunday interview, about half of it. He said it's a pattern of undermining conservatives, and they've been under fire, and they did it to me. And he posted the clips of what his answers were, and then the clips of what CBS cut out, the substantial cut of some of his best statements. He was sparring with host Margaret Brennan over the Voter Eligibility Act, which requires voters nationwide to prevent proof of citizenship when registering, and non-citizens cannot vote. But the DOJ is suing one state that was removing non-citizens from the voter rolls, and that is so outrageous. But so
my understanding is that those non-citizens had checked on the form that they were non-citizens.
Yeah.
I don't even understand it.
Yeah, well, we know why. But Johnson responded to the host and said, people have a lot of concerns about voting integrity. And he talked about the Virginia governor, Youngkin. He issued an executive order to clean up the voting rolls, and the Biden-Harris administration, as I just said, sued the governor for doing it. But Johnson said that I was talking about the North Carolina hurricane business and situation there, and the political issues involved with that, if the voting can be complete after all of that. And Johnson just said that they took out many of my comments, about half of them. And so he's accusing the network of the same thing.
It's common practice to edit comments for news purposes, but doing a interview show like that during an allotted amount of time, well, I don't know. I mean, if they said your segment's going to be 10 minutes and they do a 10-minute interview, they shouldn't really be editing it down. Now, if you signed up for a 10-minute interview and you spoke for 20 minutes, obviously they're going to have to edit it down to fit. But the accepted journalistic rule in that is any editing you do should not change the meaning or context of any of the answers given by the person you're interviewing.
Right.
So you're supposed to be very, very careful when you do those edits.
Right. Johnson said they took out some of my best counterpoints in the discussion. Kamala Harris wrote a book years ago about her professional time as a prosecutor at different levels in California. And Dr. Stefan Weber is a linguist, an English professor. He went through her book, and he's a plagiarism expert. And he's got Kamala doing all kinds of plagiarism of articles, sources, putting them in her book without quotation marks to show them, or attribution of sources. And that woman is just unethical. And he's got a lot of examples, side by side, photographic evidence of her, including taking things from a law school expert and as her own wisdom. So she just seems so unethical. Her husband's in trouble too. They called him the new kind of male. And people say he shouldn't be attacked because he's not running for office. But if she's president, he's the first husband then? But he's also been revealed to have been a person who slapped his girlfriend in public.
Allegedly.
Yes, allegedly. But he admitted it too. But he said this is just a distraction that they bring these things up. That's what he said when he was asked about it.
That's the answer of anybody in the political circles if things are brought up during a campaign.
And evidence from people who used to work at the law firm that he was a partner in said he harassed and he intimidated employees, especially women. And if they didn't flirt with him, he saw that they got bad assignments and or were relieved. So he doesn't seem to be allegedly the best person either, especially when they juxtapose he and his wife's comments on issues.
And if he is out on the campaign trail campaigning for this ticket, regardless of whether or not he should be mixed in with the political machinations, is kind of moot. You made yourself into a public figure when you did that.
Right.
And and I think it's an unfortunate part of the game, but it is part of the game.
Yeah, and he's out there criticizing Trump and
right.
Trump's alleged activities. So yeah. Trump's daughter-in-law, she's often on Fox. She was a paid contributor, but now she's not because she's involved in his campaign. She's a North Carolinian and very attractive, very articulate, very intelligent. When she goes on shows, she's just extraordinarily impressive. And she's on Trump's campaign team, and she was on Newsmax, and she said, "We are very concerned about voting access to the red state Trump voters in the areas hit by floods and hurricanes, and the Republican National Committee which I think she's the head of, I'm going to say that advisedly, is going to do everything we can to assist the voters impacted by these weather tragedies and emphasize the importance of facilitating voter access and helping the victims of these things. And we have to act. And the Trump team, by the way, is working overtime to do something about swing state voters casting ballots. They're thinking about bus service to get people to polls, because a lot of people lost their cars, they've lost their jobs, they've lost their homes. But even Democrats say they're implementing measures to see that the election runs as completely and smoothly as possible. Well, it would affect some Democrat voters too, you would think.
Well, yeah, there are parts of North Carolina that are deeply blue. There are a lot of people who are transplants from other part of the country moving into those areas because it was fairly cheap to buy property, and you know what? It's a very pretty part of the world.
Yeah.
Now, the landscapes are beautiful, and they built homes there, and they were dramatically affected by this disaster as well.
Right. And one source said, we're glad to see the North Carolina State Board of Elections come around to the Republican-led legislature's plan to extend voter access to hurricane areas. And so there's cooperation, evidently, on all fronts with dealing with that tragedy.
All right. We have a couple more minutes if you want to cover anything else.
Okay. One more thing, then. Breitbart. Arab Americans are lining up to vote for Trump in Michigan. Why Arab Americans are moving there? They're already Trump supporters because of his record in his previous administration in areas that affected positively Arab Americans. And one Arab American Michigander said, we aren't going to be told who to vote for. We are conservative Americans, and the Trump policies and Trump's articulations we find are very, very sensible. And we're helping to expand the Middle East community. And one lady said we've registered Albanian Americans, Arab Americans, and we're going to get the vote for Trump out. The Democrats cannot say that we are paralyzed and totally on their side. We're looking at lots of issues and lots of candidates.
In that part of the world, too, I think there's some headwinds for the Harris campaign based upon the Biden administration's continued support of Israel. Whether or not those voters would switch over to Trump, I'm sure some will, as you mentioned, but they may just not participate, which would hurt Harris as well.
That's right. And Trump is pro-Israel too, though, for those that are going to vote for him. They're looking at other things.
That's why I'm saying there may be non-participation, but I can imagine that if you were a entrepreneur from that part of the world with a small business in Michigan, you might look at the Trump policies more favorably than you would the Biden administration policies. Okay.
Trump espouses peace in the Middle East, too. He supports Israel, but he wants a stable Middle East, and they know that, too.
We'll take a break then. We'll come back with more. It's Rochester Today on Thursday. News Talk 1340 KROC AM at 96.9.
Rochester Today with Andy Brownell and Tom Ostrom on News Talk 1340 KROC AM and 96.9 FM.
We're back with more of Rochester Today, News Talk 1340 KROC AM and 96.9 FM. Andy Brownell along with Tom Ostrom. We're we got a few minutes left in the program. What do you want to cover? I know what I wanted to mention first. I'd read this article, Tom, and I know this isn't internet. I guess it would qualify for international because I suspect the sources of this are international. There was a series of articles in multiple publications over the past couple of days about these quote-unquote mysterious drone activities near significant U.S. military installations and sensitive civilian installations, read nuclear power plants and other that kind of facilities. And these are described as large drones, not the kind you buy at the hobby store, significant size drones in large numbers, moving in coordination at high rates of speed, that have been seen doing flybys or flying near these military installations, some in Chesapeake Bay and others in other parts of the country, and they move in and move out in such a quick fashion that they're unable to follow them. The radar installations are having difficulty tracking them because of their size and the altitudes that they're flying them on. Even local law enforcement has participated in trying to track them with little success. So they remain a mystery. The motive behind the actions, the source of the actions. These are military people being quoted that they're very concerned about this. And considering the high potential or the high usage of drones in both the Middle East and Ukraine as military weapons, I can see why this is getting quite a bit of attention within the military ranks, because they really don't have a good defense.
You bet. The Biden administration's conflicted, though. They want to keep the Arab vote, and yet they want to support Israel, and one impacts against the other. And leaked letters from the Secretary of War to an Israeli counterpart that said the Biden administration is threatening an arms embargo against Israel. Meanwhile, they're sending U.S. troops to Israel to help with the weapons that we're sending them, or the technology.
The anti-missile weapons, right.
But then they've cited concerns. They want the Israelis to feed in enemy territory Gaza residents, and they want the war to end in Gaza, and they want a two-state solution. And so they're hassling the Israelis on one hand and trying to help them on the other. And Netanyahu allegedly, I can't believe he did this, said he wouldn't hit nuclear sites in Iran and he wouldn't hit oil refineries. I can't imagine why he'd make a promise like that. But anyway, leaked documents about machinations in the Biden administration to Israeli officials, and Biden administration officials said that those were private. They were not to be made public, but they are.
I imagine they didn't want them out, right? It doesn't seem to have much of an impact on the Israeli government in their actions currently. They're continuing to aggressively move into southern Lebanon and hit what they are saying are Hezbollah targets in population centers, and civilians are being killed because Hezbollah has put these military targets in populated areas directly adjacent to civilians, and sometimes directly adjacent to UN supposed peacekeeper forces. And the Wall Street Journal is out with an editorial yesterday calling on the Biden administration to call out the UN on this, that in the 20 years the UN has had that force in southern Lebanon to, quote, enforce a peace. They have done nothing to enforce the transgressions of Hezbollah in that area by moving missile installations and heavy caches of weapons where they threaten the Israeli communities on the other side of the border, which was directly banned under the ceasefire. And the reason for that, United Nations force to be there in the first place. And they have taken no action, this being the UN, against these Hezbollah forces, even though there's quite a bit of documentation that they have put in tunnels and even missile installations within yards of UN outposts. Mm-hmm. And the editorial expressed the outrage that should be expressed by those of us paying for the United Nations.
And you pointed out that weapons caches of Israel's enemies have been found in schools and in hospitals and in people's homes.
Yeah, these are not a few rifles. These are large stores of munitions.
Right. The Ukraine war isn't getting publicity as much as it used to. Recently, Toretsk, a city in the Ukraine, has fallen to Russian forces. They control about half the city. They've broken through Ukrainian lines, and they've even launched a counteroffensive. When the Ukrainians successfully and bravely invaded Kursk in Russian territory, Russians are breaking into Ukrainian lines there too and taking Kursk back. And the Ukraine, you've mentioned the casualties that both sides are suffering, and Putin is forcing conscription on people, but Ukraine is having to do it too. Ukraine military recruiters are going into nightlife hotspots, places where people go for entertainment, and they're arresting military-age males and making them conscripts. And you can see Ukraine soldiers on the streets going into these places and taking control of young people who are in civilian clothes that they want in the army.
I just read an article as well. This is the BBC about the low morale amongst the Ukrainian forces on the front line in eastern Ukraine. And that would be self-explanatory if that's the case. If you were a young male of military age and you were grabbed off the street and detained and then put into a uniform and shoved to the front lines, you would not have a very good morale. You would not want to be there at all. And I think that's the same case for some of these Russian forces as well. They have no interest in being involved in this, and they're more or less being sacrificed.
Yeah.
And it goes both sides. And by the way, you mentioned the last show that Zelensky was going to be ready to present his peace plan. Mm-hmm. Well, he presented what he termed a victory plan to the Ukraine parliament and is presenting it to the European Union today, I believe. And it more or less is a bunch of nothing as far as I can tell. It more or less says an invitation from NATO to join is needed. No concessions on the border. Continue the policy of pushing the Russians out. A great deal of increased military assistance from the West. An agreement to allow the use of long-range weapons to attack inside Russia, which is not allowed right now, and a whole laundry list of things that are more or less a reiteration of what has been said before, but certainly not a peace plan.
No. And the globalist European Union is scrambling because there's a rotating presidency in their committee meetings, and the Hungarian Prime Minister Orban is refusing to fund the Ukrainian war effort anymore, and he's blocking attempts to fund it. And so the globalists are trying to figure out how to get around it and how to get around him. And he's also blocking more migration from illegal immigration. So he's kind of a burr under the saddle there. And the European Union globalists are trying to somehow control him or get around him.
Okay. We got to go. We'll talk to you next Tuesday, Tom. You have a great weekend.
You too.
Go Vikings.
Yeah.
All right. Tom Ostrom, I'm Andy Brownell. This has been Rochester Today. Tomorrow on the program, we will be talking with the Med City movie guy, Chris McSannick, find out what's happening in the movie theaters and our home screens. So please tune in for that. It's always a fun program. This is News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96.